My mother's laugh was the first thing I ever recorded. I was 8 years old, playing with a cassette recorder I'd found at a garage sale, a bulky Panasonic with a red record button, and a speaker that crackled like a campfire. I pressed record and held it up to her face while she washed dishes in our kitchen on Bagley Street, singing along to the radio. She laughed this big, unapologetic laugh that started in her belly and climbed out through her teeth, and she said, "Mija, what are you doing with that thing?" "Recording you," I said, "so I can play you back when you're at work." She dried her hands on her apron, the yellow one with the roosters, the one she wore every day until the roosters faded to ghosts, and she leaned into the microphone. "Then you better make it good, Mija. Because when I'm at work, I want to remember what I'm coming home to." She sang a line of Cielito Lindo, off-key and laughing, and then the doorbell rang, my aunt with groceries, or the neighbor borrowing sugar, or some other interruption that defined our life in Mexican town. I stopped the tape. I labeled it Mama 1983 in my careful third-grade cursive. I put it in a shoebox under my bed, next to the other tapes I'd made, the dog barking, the rain on the roof, my little brother Miguel crying because he dropped his ice cream. I didn't know then that I was building an archive. I didn't know that 17 years later, I would be listening to that laugh through professional-grade headphones in a soundproof studio in Los Angeles, trying to isolate it from the noise of a factory floor where my mother died. Welcome to Little Bunny Stories. If you're new here, my name is Dee. I'm 53 years old, I'm an audio forensic engineer, and I'm going to tell you about the last tape my mother ever made, the one that killed her, and the one that finally let her speak. Before we start, hit that subscribe button. Not for me. For every person who ever lost someone to a machine that could have been fixed, a warning that could have been heeded, a voice that could have been heard if anyone had bothered to listen. Here's my story. Carmen Morales was 41 when she died. She looked older, the double shifts did that, the 12-hour days on the assembly line at GM's Detroit Hamtramck assembly plant, the way she came home with grease embedded in her fingerprints and metal shavings in her hair. But she was 41, and she was beautiful, and she was the only reason Miguel and I had food, clothes, and a roof that only leaked in 3 places. My father left in 1982. I was 12, Miguel was 5. He said he was going to find work in Chicago, that he'd send money, that he'd be back by Christmas. The money never came. Neither did he. My mother never said his name again, not in anger, not in grief, not at all. It was like she'd edited him out of the family tape, cutting him at the splice and taping over the gap with overtime shifts and secondhand textbooks, and the kind of optimism that only makes sense if you've never had another choice. She worked days at the plant and nights cleaning offices downtown. On weekends, she did alterations for a tailor on Verner Highway, hemming pants, taking in waists, the kind of invisible labor that keeps a community dressed and never gets thanked. She slept 4 hours a night, sometimes 5 if Miguel and I were quiet enough. She ate standing up. She hummed while she worked, always rancheras, boleros, songs from her childhood in Guanajuato that she'd never taught us the words to because she said they were too sad for children. I was 15 when she died. A Tuesday in October, 1985. I remember because I'd had a history test that morning, the French Revolution, which seemed impossibly distant from anything in my life, and I'd been studying flashcards on the bus when my Aunt Rosa met me at the stop, her face the color of old ash, and she said, "Mija, you need to come with me." The plant manager called it an industrial accident. The union rep called it a tragic workplace incident. The newspaper called it a single-vehicle collision on the factory floor, which made it sound like my mother had been driving a car instead of standing at her station when Press 7 malfunctioned, and the safety cage that was supposed to hold a 2-ton steel die failed to engage. She was crushed. Instantly, they said. She wouldn't have felt anything, they said. The safety inspector, who hadn't inspected Press 7 in 14 months, signed a report saying the equipment was within operational parameters, and the accident was unforeseeable. The company offered $12,000. For the children, they said, sliding a check across a conference table like they were tipping a waitress. My Aunt Rosa, who'd become our guardian by default, looked at the check and looked at the lawyer GM had sent, a young man in a suit that cost more than our car, and she said, "We need to think about this." We thought about it for 3 weeks. Then the union rep came to our house, not the local guy, but someone from regional, someone who smelled like expensive cologne and spoke Spanish with an accent that sounded rehearsed. He said the union couldn't support a claim against GM. The equipment was maintained according to schedule, he said, reading from a paper he didn't let us see. Your sister, your co-matter, she was a good worker, but she may have been distracted. These things happen. The company's offer is generous. You should take it. Rosa took it. She used $3,000 for the funeral, a closed casket, because my mother didn't look like my mother anymore. She used $4,000 to pay off debts my mother had hidden, credit cards she'd used to buy Miguel's asthma medication, and my school uniforms. She put the remaining $5,000 in a savings account for the children's future, which turned out to be my GED test fees and Miguel's first semester at community college, which he never finished. I didn't go to the funeral, I couldn't. I sat in my mother's closet, surrounded by her clothes, the yellow apron, the work shirts with her name embroidered in red thread, the dress she'd worn to my quinceañera that she'd saved for 6 months to buy, and I listened to the tapes. I'd found them 3 days after she died, while Rosa was at the funeral home making arrangements. They were in a box in the basement, behind the water heater, wrapped in plastic bags like something that needed protection from the damp. 37 cassette tapes, labeled with dates and initials, GM3/15, GM4/2, GM5/8, and one that was different. That one was labeled Para Diana in my mother's handwriting, the letters careful and round, the way she wrote when she was trying to be formal. I didn't have a tape player. Ours had broken 6 months before, and my mother had never replaced it. Next paycheck, she'd always said. But the next paycheck went to Miguel's inhalers, or the electric bill, or the shoes I'd outgrown. I took the tapes to my friend Tito, whose older brother had a boom box in his bedroom, and I played the first one while Tito sat on his bed, pretending to do homework, watching me with the careful eyes of a boy who knew something was wrong but didn't know what to say. The tape was static at first, then voices. Faint, distant, like they were coming from another room. I turned up the volume until the speaker crackled, and then I heard my mother's voice, not singing, not laughing, but speaking in a whisper so intense it sounded like she was trying to push the words through the tape itself. The safety cage on press 7. I reported it again today. The supervisor said he'd look into it. He's been looking into it for 3 months. The other girls are scared to say anything. I'm scared too, but Mija, if something happens to me, if you're listening to this, you need to know it wasn't an accident. They knew, they've always known. Then another voice. A man's voice, muffled like my mother had hidden the recorder in her pocket or her lunch bag. Budget constraints, next quarter. These things take time. My mother's whisper again, budget constraints. My life is a budget constraint. The tape ended. I sat there, the boom box humming with dead air, and I felt something crack inside me, not my heart, not something so poetic, something structural. A beam that had been holding up the ceiling of my world, snapping under a weight it was never designed to carry. Tito's brother had 36 more tapes. I listened to all of them that night, hunched over the boom box with headphones clamped to my ears, volume turned up until my eardrums ached. Conversations captured in break rooms, in bathrooms, in the parking lot where my mother sat in her car during lunch, speaking into a recorder she'd bought with money she'd saved from her alteration work, $39.99 at Kmart, according to the receipt I found in the box. She'd been recording for 8 months. 8 months of whispered warnings, of supervisors deflecting, of union reps changing the subject. 8 months of her own voice, growing more desperate, more resigned, more certain that something terrible was coming and nobody cared enough to stop it. And then, on the last tape, dated 3 days before she died, a conversation that made me stop breathing. The repair order came through, upper management approved it. My mother's voice when next quarter, after the fiscal review, that's 3 months. The cage could fail tomorrow. Carmen, I know, but if I push any harder they'll transfer me or worse. I have a family too, so do I. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Then silence. Not the silence of a stopped tape, the silence of 2 people who have run out of words, out of hope, out of the belief that saying something changes anything. I played that tape 17 times. Then I put all 37 in my backpack, along with the receipt for the recorder and a notebook where I'd transcribed every word, and I went to find a lawyer. His name was Harold Flesher, and he had an office above a bail bondsman on Michigan Avenue. The carpet smelled like cigarettes, and the walls were covered with diplomas from a law school I'd never heard of. He listened to 10 minutes of the first tape, the one with the supervisor saying budget constraints, and then he stopped the player and said, "How old are you?" 15, I said. "And your guardian, your aunt, does she know you have these?" "No." He nodded, not unkindly. "Diana, can I call you Diana? I want you to understand something. What happened to your mother was terrible, it was wrong, it should never have happened. But the law has limits. The statute of limitations for workplace negligence in Michigan is 3 years. Your mother died 2 months ago. Even if we filed tomorrow, GM has teams of lawyers who would bury us in motions until the clock runs out. But they knew, I said. My voice didn't shake. I was proud of that. They knew the machine was dangerous. They chose not to fix it. That's not negligence. That's murder. The law doesn't see it that way. And even if it did, he gestured at the tapes, these recordings were made without consent. In Michigan, that's a felony. You could be charged. Your mother could have been charged. Any competent defense attorney would argue these tapes are inadmissible. So they're useless, not useless. He leaned forward, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes, not greed exactly, but something adjacent to it. Valuable, actually, to the right buyer. GM would pay good money to make sure these never see the light of day, or a journalist, or a union with more backbone than the one your mother had. How much? He named a number. $500. For 37 tapes, for my mother's voice. For the last thing she ever said before a 2-ton steel die proved her right. I stood up. I put the tapes back in my backpack. I walked out of his office and I didn't look back. I kept walking. Past the bail bondsman, past the liquor store, past the church where my mother had been baptized and married and would have been buried if we'd been able to afford a plot. I walked to the river, to the concrete embankment where kids went to smoke and couples went to be alone, and I sat there until it got dark. Then I made a decision. Not a plan. I was 15, I didn't know how to make plans. Just a decision. I would become someone who could make these tapes matter. Someone with skills, with credentials, with the kind of expertise that turns static into evidence and whispers into proof. I would learn to hear what other people couldn't hear, to find voices in noise, to make the inaudible undeniable. And then I would come back. I left school 2 weeks later. Not dropped out, left. I told my teachers I was transferring. I told Miguel I was going to make things better. I told Rosa I was sorry, that I'd send money, that I'd be back for holidays. She didn't believe me. She was right not to. I moved to Los Angeles with $200 I'd saved from cleaning offices, my mother's night job, which I'd taken over within a week of her death. I slept on a couch in East LA, in the apartment of a cousin I'd met twice, who worked nights at a hospital and didn't care if I was there as long as I was gone by morning. I got a job at a recording studio in Hollywood, not making music, but cleaning toilets and emptying ashtrays and learning by osmosis, watching engineers through glass windows, memorizing the names of equipment I couldn't afford. By 20, I'd talked my way into a community college audio engineering program. By 23, I had an internship at a post-production house that worked on movies, real movies, with budgets and stars and soundtracks that cost more than my mother had earned in 10 years. By 26, I was a full-time engineer, specializing in dialogue editing, the invisible art of making actors sound clear in scenes where helicopters were crashing and buildings were exploding. By 30, I was bored. Dialogue editing was technical, precise, satisfying in its way, but it was fiction. It was make-believe. I wanted to work with real sound, real voices, real evidence of things that had actually happened. I found it in forensic audio. The FBI had a lab in Quantico where they analyzed recordings for criminal cases, wiretaps, 911 calls, ransom demands, anything where sound was evidence. They contracted some work to private labs, and one of those labs was in Burbank, run by a man named Dr. Samuel Okonkwo, who'd written the textbook on audio forensics and who interviewed me for 3 hours before he hired me. Why this work? He asked at the end of the interview. You could make 3 times as much in film. Because film is lies, I said. This is truth. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, you start Monday. I spent 20 years in that lab. I learned to isolate a voice from restaurant noise, to prove that a recording had been edited, to authenticate tapes that defendants claimed were fakes. I testified in court 4 to 7 times, murder trials, fraud cases, terrorism prosecutions. I was good at it. I was good at it because I'd been training since I was 8 years old, recording my mother's laugh on a garage sale Panasonic. And I never forgot the tapes. They were in a safe deposit box at a bank in downtown LA, the same box since 1995, when I'd finally been able to afford one. I'd listened to them occasionally over the years, on anniversaries, on bad days, on nights when I couldn't sleep and needed to hear my mother's voice saying my name. But I'd never done anything with them. I didn't know what to do. The lawyer had been right about the statute of limitations. Write about the legality of the recordings. Write about everything except the part where he thought $500 was a fair price for my mother's last words. Then, in February of 2025, Miguel called. I hadn't spoken to my brother in 12 years. Not because of a fight, we'd never been close enough to fight. Just because we'd become strangers who happened to share a last name and a dead mother. He was in Detroit, I was in LA, and the distance between us was measured in more than miles. He was 48 now. He'd worked at the Hamtramck plant for 23 years, the same plant, the same line, the same machines that had killed our mother. He'd married twice, divorced twice, had a daughter he didn't see. He drank. He'd always drunk, but it was worse now, according to the occasional updates I got from Rosa before she died in 2019. He said, and his voice sounded like our father's, thin, uncertain. The voice of a man who'd learned that the world doesn't reward honesty. I found something. You need to see it. He sent me a package. Inside, a hard drive, old, the kind with a USB 2.0 connector that I had to buy an adapter to read. And a note written in Miguel's shaky handwriting. They were throwing everything out. Plants closing next year. I took this before they shredded it. I don't know what's on it. But it's from 1985, I thought. I thought you should have it. I plugged it into my home computer, not my work equipment, never my work equipment. I knew better than to mix personal and professional, and I started reading. Emails. Corporate emails from GM's internal system, preserved on a backup drive that someone had forgotten to wipe. Most of it was mundane, production schedules, supply orders, memos about parking regulations. But in a folder labeled Maintenance, Press 7, I found it. An email from the plant manager, dated October 2, 1985, 3 days before my mother died. To Regional Operations from Hamtramck Plant Manager Press 7 Safety Cage Repair Urgent Repair Request submitted for Press 7 Safety Cage Mechanism. Estimated cost, $47,000. Mechanism has failed twice in past month. Operator injury risk classified as high. Request immediate approval for emergency repair. Response same day to Hamtramck Plant Manager from Regional Operations Press 7 Safety Cage Repair Request denied. Budget allocated for Q1 1986 maintenance cycle. Advise temporary workaround protocols. Margins for Q4 currently below target, discretionary spending frozen until fiscal review. I read it 10 times. Then I printed it. Then I read it again. They knew. Not just my mother's supervisor, not just the safety inspector who'd falsified reports. Corporate knew. Regional operations knew. Someone in an office, probably in Detroit, possibly in New York, had looked at a $47,000 repair request and a high injury risk classification and had chosen margins over lives. My mother's life. I sat in my apartment, a nice apartment now, in Silver Lake, with windows and plants and a kitchen I never used, and I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I did what I'd been trained to do. I gathered evidence. I took 2 weeks off work. I told Dr. Okonkwo I was dealing with a family matter. He didn't ask questions. He'd learned over 20 years that I didn't volunteer information and he shouldn't ask for it. I went to the safe deposit box. I brought home the tapes, all 37, plus the one labeled Para Diana, plus the receipt for the recorder, plus my teenage transcriptions. Yellowed now, written in the handwriting of a girl who still believed that justice was possible. I set up my equipment. Not the lab gear, my personal rig, the one I'd built over years, piece by piece, the way my mother had built her life. High-end analog-to-digital converters, noise reduction software, spectral analysis tools. I transferred the tapes to digital, sample by sample, preserving every click and pop and breath. Then I started cleaning. The tapes were damaged. 40 years in a basement, in plastic bags, in a safe deposit box had taken their toll. The oxide was flaking. The sound was muffled, buried under hiss and hum and the ambient noise of a factory floor. But I had skills now that I didn't have at 15. I had tools. I had patience. I spent 3 days on the first tape alone, filtering out the 60-cycle hum from the fluorescent lights, isolating the frequency range of my mother's voice, alto, slightly nasal, the voice that had sung me to sleep and scolded me for leaving dishes in the sink, enhancing the muffled male voices that spoke over her, around her, through her. By the end of the first week, I had a clean transcript. By the end of the second, I had spectrograms, visual representations of sound that showed, scientifically, that the recordings were authentic. No edits. No splices. Just my mother's voice, captured in real time, saying things that GM had spent 40 years pretending she never said. I could have taken it to a lawyer. I could have filed a lawsuit, not for wrongful death, the statute had expired, but for something else. Fraud, concealment. The kind of civil claim that corporations settle quietly with NDAs and checks with many zeros. I didn't. I made a podcast, not a true crime podcast, not a victim narrative with dramatic music and a host who whispers like they're in a library. Something else. Something that matched my skills, my temperament, the person I'd become instead of the girl I'd been. I called it The Last Tape. The first episode was about audio engineering. I explained how cassette tapes work, the magnetic particles, the bias signal, the way sound is physically embedded in a strip of plastic. I explained noise reduction, frequency analysis, the science of proving that a recording is what it claims to be. The second episode was about factory safety. I interviewed a mechanical engineer who'd worked for OSHA for 30 years. We talked about press safety cages, about maintenance schedules, about the difference between recommended repair and urgent repair, and we'll fix it next quarter if margins allow. The third episode was about my mother. Not her death, her life. I played the tape of her singing Cielito Lindo in our kitchen, the one I'd made when I was 8. I talked about her double shifts, her alterations business, her hands that smelled like grease and orange blossom water. She'd worn the same perfume as her mother, a scent that never quite washed out. And then, in the fourth episode, I played the evidence. I didn't editorialize. I didn't need to. I played the tape of my mother whispering about Press 7, followed by the email from regional operations denying the repair. I played the supervisor saying budget constraints, followed by a spreadsheet showing GM's Q for 1985 profits, $2.3 billion. I played the engineer crying, saying he'd reported the danger 3 times, followed by his personnel file showing he'd been transferred to a plant in Ohio 2 months after my mother died. I ended each episode the same way. My mother's voice, not the whispered recordings from the factory, but the laugh from the kitchen tape. The big, unapologetic laugh that started in her belly. The laugh that said, despite everything, that she loved being alive, that she loved me, that she was more than the machine that killed her. Mija, she'd say at the end of every tape, captured accidentally while she was recording something else. Cuando seas grand, no trabajes en fábrica. Tu eres más que esto. When you grow up, don't work in a factory, you're more than this. The podcast found its audience slowly, then all at once. Engineers listened because I was one of them, precise, technical, respectful of the science. Union organizers listened because the story was their story, the story of every worker who's been told that their safety is a line item. Lawyers listened because they smelled a case, even if they couldn't figure out how to file it. By episode 6, the last tape was in the top 50 on Spotify. By episode 8, it was being discussed in labor law classes and engineering ethics seminars. By episode 10, the final episode where I played the complete, unedited recording of my mother's last factory tape, from beginning to end, it had been downloaded 2 million times. GM noticed. Their legal team sent a letter. Not a cease and desist, they were too smart for that, too aware that silencing a daughter telling her mother's story would be worse PR than the story itself. They offered a meeting. To discuss resolution, they said, to address your concerns. I met with them in a conference room in downtown Detroit, 40 years after my mother's death, 5 miles from the plant where she'd worked. 3 lawyers, 2 PR executives, 1 woman from their corporate social responsibility department who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Miss Morales, the lead lawyer, said. He was my age, maybe younger, with hair that was starting to gray at the temples and a voice that had been trained to sound sympathetic. We want to acknowledge the tragedy of your mother's death. We want to make things right. How much? I asked. He named a number. 7 figures. A foundation in my mother's name. A scholarship for children of factory workers. A public apology, carefully worded, vetted by legal. Admitting regrettable decisions without admitting liability. No, I said. They blinked. All of them simultaneously, like a flock of birds changing direction. Miss Morales, I don't want your money. I don't want your scholarship. I don't want your apology, which isn't an apology, it's a press release with feelings. Then what do you want? I slid a piece of paper across the table. I typed it that morning in my hotel room, after waking up at 4 a.m. because my body still thought it was on LA time. I said, a foundation, not a scholarship. A permanent, endowed organization dedicated to industrial safety, headquartered in Detroit, run by former factory workers, not corporate executives. Named after my mother, the Carmen Morales Foundation for Workplace Safety. Annual budget of no less than $2 million, adjusted for inflation in perpetuity. 2. GM must publish publicly and permanently the complete email archive from the Hamtramck plant for 1985, including all maintenance requests, safety reports, and management responses. Not a summary, not a redacted version. The complete archive, searchable, accessible to anyone. 3. The Hamtramck plant, which you're closing next year, must be preserved, not demolished. The building, the equipment, the records, turned into a museum of American manufacturing with a permanent exhibit on workplace safety featuring my mother's story. Not as tragedy, as evidence. The lawyers looked at each other. The PR executives looked at their phones. The CSR woman looked at me, and for the first time I saw something in her eyes that wasn't corporate caution. It was recognition. "You're asking us to admit guilt," the lead lawyer said. "I'm asking you to admit truth," I said. "There's a difference. Guilt is for courts. Truth is for everyone." They took 3 weeks to respond. When they did, they accepted all 3 conditions. Not gracefully, there were lawyers, negotiations, details that took 6 months to finalize. But they accepted. I don't know if they did it because they were afraid of me, or afraid of the podcast, or afraid of what would happen if 2 million listeners decided that GM was the kind of company that let mothers die to save $47,000. I don't care why they did it. I care that they did. The Carmen Morales Foundation opened in March of 2026. I didn't go to the ribbon cutting. I don't do ceremonies, don't do speeches, don't do the kind of public performance that turns grief into content. I sent a video message, recorded in my studio, where I explained what the foundation would do: train workers to recognize safety violations, provide legal support for whistleblowers, maintain a public database of industrial accidents and corporate responses. My mother didn't die because GM didn't know the machine was dangerous, I said into the camera. She died because they knew, and they decided not to care. The foundation exists to make that decision harder, to make the cost of not caring higher than the cost of fixing what's broken. I ended with her laugh. The kitchen laugh, the Cielito Lindo laugh, the laugh that said, despite everything, that being alive was worth the trouble. The Hamtramck plant is still standing. They're converting it now, not a museum exactly, but something like one. A Center for Industrial Heritage and Worker Safety, they're calling it. The Press 7 safety cage is on display, the actual cage, the one that failed, the one that killed my mother. Next to it, a plaque with her name, her dates, and a quote from the last tape. They knew, they've always known. Miguel didn't go to the opening either. He's still drinking, still working at the plant, or he was until it closed. Now he's on disability, living in a house in Mexican town that needs a new roof, caring for daughter he finally reconnected with after the podcast made him famous by association. I sent him equipment, a professional recorder, microphones, headphones, the kind of gear I use in my studio. I included a note: record what you hear. The machines, the workers, the sounds of a city that built America and got left behind. Not for revenge, for memory. For the people who come after us, who need to know what this place was. He sent me a tape last month. I listened to it in my studio, on the same equipment I'd used to clean my mother's recordings. It was mostly noise, the plant's final days, the machines being dismantled, the workers saying goodbye to jobs they'd held for decades. But at the end, after the noise faded, there was Miguel's voice. Slurred, probably drunk, but clear enough. "Mama," he said, "Tia escucho, todavía tia escucho. I hear you, I still hear you." I didn't cry. I don't cry anymore, not because I'm cold, but because I've found other ways to feel. I took Miguel's recording and I mixed it with my mother's laugh, creating something that wasn't music and wasn't justice and wasn't even really a podcast. It was just sound, just memory, just 2 voices separated by 40 years and 2,000 miles saying the same thing in different ways. I played it once. Then I put it in the safe deposit box, next to the original tapes, next to the receipt for the Panasonic recorder, next to everything I'd collected and preserved and fought to make matter. I'm Diana Morales. I'm 53 years old. I'm an audio forensic engineer, a podcaster, and the daughter of a woman who died because a corporation decided that $47,000 was too much to spend on her life. I spent 35 years learning to hear what other people couldn't hear: voices in static, truth in noise, justice in frequencies that most people ignore. I didn't become an engineer to get revenge. I became an engineer to become someone who could make my mother's voice loud enough to drown out the machines that killed her. And I did. Not with a lawsuit, not with a settlement, not with the kind of dramatic confrontation that makes good television. I did it with patience, with precision, with the stubborn belief that if you record something, if you preserve it, if you refuse to let it be forgotten, eventually someone will listen. My mother was right. I was more than a factory. I was more than a victim's daughter. I was more than the girl who sat by a river in Detroit, holding 37 cassette tapes and wondering if they were worth anything. I was someone who could take static and turn it into a story, who could take a whisper and make it a shout, who could take a laugh from a kitchen in 1983 and make it echo in a conference room in 2025, in a foundation office in 2026, in the headphones of anyone who needs to remember that behind every industrial accident is a person who loved and laughed and deserved better than to be a budget constraint. I'm 53, and this is my story. See you in the next one.